Okay, so somebody here at the briefing, State Department briefing, is asking a relatively good question that seems to have got a bit of a reaction out of the room. Um, because it seems obvious on first thought. Um, they are concerned that the amount of money being put into Gaza for reconstruction is pointless if the end result um, is inevitably the case that it's just going to get destroyed again. And that leads to the logical deduction that perhaps instead of pumping money into the region, and the spokesperson here points out that the Europeans are particularly frustrated by this. Um, Instead of just pumping money into the region, perhaps the people responsible for the damage should be requested to um, uh, deal with the damages, um, to pay for the reconstruction. I just wanted to explore this topic a little bit um, because certainly think that it. See, what it does is it draws attention to the real problem here, which is the lack of law. There's no rule of law in the region. The Israelis don't follow any concept of law. The Palestinians don't follow any concept of law. You've got these various terrorist groups out in Syria, and I guess in the direct context it's Syria, and in Lebanon, and they don't follow any concept of law. The government in Syria doesn't cover any concept of law. The government in Egypt doesn't follow any concept of law, and the government in Turkey doesn't even really follow any concept of law. So there's really no concept of law anywhere around there. Um, you've got to go all the way out to the Saudis before you get any concept of law, and then it's like the most draconian law you could imagine, right? So, or the Saudis or the Iranians. Um, and what's on the other side of Egypt? What's on the other side of Egypt is Libya. So, and then there's Algeria. So I mean, it's like there's no concept of law, right? And so they're saying, who pays for all of this damage? Well, that's what law is for. That's what law determines, right? That's what law does. Is it looks at questions. It says who owns this property, and who is responsible for doing things to damage this property, and therefore who should pay the damages. Um, and if you could establish a concept of international law, you would have answers to these questions. I don't really think there's a lot of ambiguity here, right? If you look at the scenario, it's often, if we just think about tort law for a second, does Israel act like a reasonable person? I mean, this is the whole argument against proportional responses, right? Is that they don't act like reasonable people, and so they don't uphold this reasonable person standard. Could you argue that the Israelis are often not just negligent, but criminally negligent? I think that it would be very hard to argue against that. And I think that if we had a concept of law here, a lot of the problems would very quickly resolve themselves. Now, the argument against this, of course, is that let's take it back a step back for a second, because I forgot to point out the country that is the least interested in law. Do I even need to point it out? Oh, Jose. So, Yeah, I don't even know the words though. It's just like, yeah, I just think of some, you know. You know who I actually think of is Jose Canseco. That's what I always, because that was my age. He was playing for the uh, Oakland Athletics. Did the Oakland Athletics even still exist? I don't even know. But anyways, obviously, if the Americans themselves would follow some concept of law, um, beyond the um, lip service to it, and if they would actually enforce, well, I mean, the reason that nobody else follows the law is because the Americans don't follow the law, and because they don't enforce the law. Um, I've been clear over this point over and over again as well, is that um, any law is only as valuable as the size of the stick that beats people down with it, right? Law is violence, and if you don't have violence, then you don't have law. But you have this consensus. Um, and we need that their social revolution before we can get to that. So for right now, if you want a law, you need a stick, and the people holding the stick aren't using it because they don't want to, right? If they used the stick, then they'd have to follow the rules themselves, although they wouldn't, right? Actual reality is that the Americans could force other people to follow the law and not follow it themselves, and there wouldn't really be a lot anybody could do about it. Um, it's not really that far from the truth of it, but they don't even bother doing that. They just ignore the law themselves, and then they don't expect anybody else to follow the law, and then there is no law, right? So, I want to talk about global orders and everything else. I mean, if if the United States is the policeman of the world, it is an obese donut eating, uh, you know, it's the worst fucking cop on the beat, right? So nobody follows these laws. Now that said, the argument against, these kinds of arguments, right? I mean, well, actually, let me take a step back again. I think that what I was trying to get, well, I forgot exactly what I said, but people don't even frame it in the concept of a law, right? When people say the Israelis should pay for what they blow up, the context is that, like, the Secretary of State is going to show up in Tel Aviv and be like, "You guys got to do this," and or else we won't pay for military contracts. Or like they think of it in these, like, authoritarian, dictatorial terms. It never crosses their mind that maybe a court of law, and that maybe a judge should have these things put in front of them, and that it should be held up to a set of legal precedents and values, like this, because we live in a system, or we live in a society where law doesn't really exist, right? Um, so you got to put that you've got to we have to understand what it is that we're actually talking about here, and it's not when these journalists say it and when you hear it in the media, they're not talking about actually implementing law. They're talking about using authority and leverage and other. Um, they're talking about using violence to enforce violence, right? Using violence to enforce violence to prevent violence, which is symptomatic of the problem that there is no law, and nobody wants law, unfortunately. So if you put it in that context, of course, the argument against forcing the Jews to pay for it is that then the Israelis, then the Palestinians get it in their mind that they can do whatever they want, and the Jews will just rebuild it, right? But that's why we have a system of law, because in order to prevent that sort of thing, right? In order to look at the situation and say, okay, who is actually at fault here? Who is negligent? Who is responsible? And if it turns out that, the, well, I mean, that's something that would have to be developed in the law, right? a system of precedent would have to develop on that, and you would expect that a system of law in place would conclude that if the Palestinians are shooting their firecrackers over the border there, and scaring the goats, then they should be responsible for any damages that they incur or any and deal with any consequences of their aggression, subject to the law. Now you might say that that means taking away their sovereignty. Well, I don't. I don't care about your fucking sovereignty, right? That would be a good thing, actually, to take away, because this is a nation state, right? This is a xenophobic, nationalistic, basically racist state, and it probably should not exist, at least not in the terms it does. I'm not really that upset about that, but or at the very least, we should at least agree that your sovereignty is only useful relative to its ability to not oppress others, right? Being sovereign doesn't mean you can hurt people that aren't in agreement with you, and if it does, it should mean that you yourself have to deal with the consequences. And how do we regulate this? How do we understand this? How do we deal with this? That's what the law is for. That said, even if you warp the situation backwards, right, and you allow yourself to be stuck in this backwards thinking, is that not itself an argument that the Palestinians need economic development? For if the Palestinians are willing to essentially, what's the word I'm looking for here? My head is still scattered from the gas leak in here. Keeping in mind that my head's scattered. If the Palestinians want to initialize or instigate, that's what I'm looking for. If the Palestinians want to instigate this kind of violence under the assumption that they can get away with whatever they want, is that not evidence that the economic system or the economic realities in Palestine are horrific? And is that not an argument to focus on the economic development in the region? Is that not the answer? Instead of saying that we shouldn't have law, why don't we say that in order for a legal system to function, you have to approach it on the basis of equals? I don't think that what I'm saying crossed anybody's mind in this room. I think that they just were operating on a very simplistic, punitive level, right? If you do the crime, then you should pay. If you commit the crime, then you should do the time, right? That's the logic that they're thinking, right? If you blow something up, you should rebuild it. And it doesn't seem to cross anybody's mind that the actual important part of their thinking, the crux of their logic and deduction on that point, is in putting in place a system that determines this. Everything else aside, okay, there needs to be a concept of the rule of law that has to exist. And if there's not some concept of the rule of law, this is never going to end.